inversion tree. Clara died at 52, which, for someone like her, felt both too early and perfectly on time. She had not been the sort to chase death, nor had she fought it. She had simply nodded, like a guest politely leaving the party before the music got too loud. Her final moment was uneventful in the eyes of the world. No headlines, no dramatic monologue, just a sigh, long and low, like the last note of a cello, and the soft clink of a teaspoon settling in an empty mug. Clara had lived a quiet life, not the kind that wins awards, but the kind that leaves a dent in a pillow and a warm teacup ring on a wooden table. She had never married. She had almost once, but the man had laughed too loudly at her favorite poem, and that, for Clara, was a kind of violence. She had worked in a library where she shelved the same books so often she could hear their spines sigh when touched. She never finished writing her own novel, but she once wrote a love letter to a lemon tree, and that somehow felt more honest. She was the kind of person who always returned her shopping cart and never quite believed anyone could truly love her for more than a season. She had felt too much and said too little. Her friends would have called her kind, but always with a pause afterward, as if that word wasn't quite enough. And when Clara died, there was no tunnel, no glowing grandfather, no angel choir, no scales, no judgment, no gates. Instead, there was a breeze. It smelled like citrus and memory, and felt like fingers brushing your wrist when someone almost takes your hand but doesn't. The ground beneath her was moss, but not ordinary moss. It pulsed faintly, like it had a heartbeat, and smelled like earth remembering rain. And then she looked up. Before her stood a tree, not large, vast. Its trunk was so wide it had weather systems. Clouds clung to its upper branches. Lightning tickled its leaves. Birds nested in the grooves of its bark, the way thoughts hide in wrinkles. It wasn't a normal tree, but you already guessed that. It shimmered between forms. Sometimes an olive tree, sometimes a redwood, sometimes something entirely unbotanical, like a cathedral trying on bark for the weekend. Clara took a step closer, and as she did, she saw herself. Thousands of her. Tens of thousands. Like glimmers in soap bubbles, right before they pop. Each version of her danced on a branch. A life she might have lived had she said yes instead of no. Left instead of stayed. Spoken instead of swallowed. There was the Clara who studied marine biology. She had deep tan lines and the permanent squint of someone who stared into sunlit waves. Another Clara had 3 children and wore the proud exhaustion of someone who had cleaned up glitter for 20 consecutive years. One Clara owned a bookstore in Portugal. She always smelled like cardamom and wore too many scarves, even in July. Yet another Clara never left home, tended to her mother until the end. She was quiet, but carried a universe in the way she arranged fresh flowers on the table every Sunday. Clara wandered beneath the branches of the tree, barefoot. The grass was velvet, with a hint of mint, as if heaven had recently chewed gum. She peered into each version of herself like a guest walking through open windows. At first she panicked. Her heart, if she still had one, ached. All these lives she didn't live. All those choices she never dared to make. Regrets bloomed like wild flowers, thick and stubborn. But the longer she stayed, the more she saw. The Clara with children cried in the laundry room once a week. The bookstore Clara was lonely. her scarves a kind of armor. The marine biologist sometimes wished she had become a librarian. Each life had its own quiet sorrows and its own private miracles. There were no perfect Claires, just different ones. Some were braver, some were softer, some were deeply flawed and wildly loved anyway. She laughed, a soft, startled laugh, the kind you let out when you realized the punchline was never meant to hurt you. She sat down at the foot of the tree. The bark was warm. It pulsed gently, as if the tree was breathing with her. A leaf landed in her lap. It was translucent and gold, and written on it, in her own handwriting, was a phrase she never remembered writing. You are not the only version of yourself that matters, but you are the one who held the pen. She smiled. The forest wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a judgment. It was a reunion with everything she had the courage not to be. And in the end, that courage meant something too. She stayed a while longer, long enough to wave at the Clara who'd sung jazz in New Orleans, and nod respectfully to the Clara who'd once invented a new kind of omelette. And when the time came, though time is a clumsy word here, she let go. The tree folded like origami into a speck of light. The forest turned to mist, and Clara, well, Clara dissolved into something like music, not the kind you hear, the kind you feel in your bones when someone you love says your name in a way that makes you believe you're real. She never asked what came next. For the first time in all her versions, she wasn't waiting for a better one. The table is set. His name was Paolo, and he died the same way he lived, unnoticed, but never unkind. It happened on a Tuesday, which is fitting, really. He always liked Tuesdays. Mondays were too loud. Wednesdays were confused. But Tuesdays? Tuesdays were modest. They didn't demand anything of you except to keep going. Paolo was 73 and had worn cardigans since he was 20. Not out of fashion, but because he liked pockets and the feeling of something wrapping itself gently around his shoulders. He had been a waiter, a cook, then, eventually, just a man with a kitchen that smelled like rosemary. He never married, though once he almost did, to a woman named Elise, who loved thunderstorms and hated tomatoes. But her train left the city before he found the words to say, "I'd like to make you soup for the rest of your life." And so, he didn't. Paolo's life was full of little things. He knew the exact number of turns to open a stubborn jar lid. He knew how to tell when rice was done by listening to the pot. And he knew how to make people feel just a little less lonely without ever saying, "I see you." He made soup for the old lady across the hall when her cat died. He baked bread every Sunday and left half loaves in wax paper on doorsteps without notes. He brought Tupperware to funerals. He brought apricots to the park. No one called him a hero, but the pigeons knew his footsteps by heart. And when his breath finally faded, there were no trumpets, only the quiet click of a gas stove being turned off one last time. And then he awoke, not suddenly, more like when you drift up from a nap because a smell has found its way to you. It was cinnamon and garlic and something else, something he could never name, but always tasted in his mother's kitchen when she was happiest. He opened his eyes to find himself standing in a long corridor lined with windows that looked out onto nothing and everything. The walls were warm terracotta, the floor old wood polished by generations of bare feet. He walked slowly. His joints didn't ache, but he still moved with the grace of someone who had learned to listen to his knees. At the end of the corridor, a dining room. It was round, high-ceilinged, lit by floating orbs of soft amber, like fireflies who had found steady work. The table stretched in all directions, curved and winding, never ending, never repeating. It was cluttered, beautifully, linen napkins folded with whimsy, candles melting into each other, plates mismatched like old friends, and seated at the table, people, hundreds, maybe thousands. Some were laughing, some were eating, some were weeping softly into bowls of stew, and every one of them looked up at Paolo with eyes that said, "There you are." He didn't recognize them all, not at first, but something in his chest did. A quiet tug, like the pull of gravity you only notice when it's gone. There was the woman from the bus stop he had once shared his umbrella with. There was the child from the cafe who spilled hot chocolate on his coat and whom he comforted without a flinch. There were neighbors he'd fed, strangers he'd helped, even a man he'd once rescued from choking on a fishbone in 1983. And each one of them held a dish, food he had made, or inspired, or reminded them of, and they had cooked it for him. Here was soup with soft potatoes and that certain quiet you can taste. Here was bread, still warm, with a crust that sang when cracked, and there, a plate of tomatoes prepared by Elise. Yes, Elise was here too. She looked older than he remembered, which was a relief somehow. He'd always been afraid he'd remember her, only in her youth. But here she was, silver-haired, radiant, and still unwilling to eat her own tomato dish. "I made it for you," she said, with a crooked smile, "and I still think they're disgusting." They laughed, and in that laugh was every conversation they never had, every shared breakfast they missed, every long walk they never took, because he had been too afraid of asking for something so big. In this place, time folded like dough. It was always dinner time, and always dessert. It was the first bite and the last sip of wine. The light was the color of late afternoon and smelled faintly of flour. The air hummed with forks, tapping plates, and someone humming an old lullaby in another room. Paolo sat, not at the head of the table. There was no head. He simply chose a chair and was immediately brought a dish he had once cooked on a rainy Tuesday for a friend who had just lost their job. He took a bite. It was perfect because it wasn't perfect. The salt was a little off, the carrot slightly overdone, but the memory, the warmth here, the act of feeding, was the final form of love, and every kindness he had ever offered had pulled up a seat. No one asked what he had accomplished. No one listed his career. They only remembered how they felt when he handed them something warm and said, "Eat." And when Paolo finally looked around the table, tears in his eyes, heart filled with something so large it could not be named, he realized something. This was heaven, not because it was reward, but because it was reflection. He built this place, one lentil, one smile, one careful pinch of salt at a time, and it would go on long after him as others passed through, brought in their dishes, and sat at the same table, because the table was never really his. He had only been setting it. the Garden of Firsts. Her name was Aiko. She died at 84, but she had stopped truly living, she thought, sometime around 42. She wouldn't have said that out loud, of course. She was polite, the kind of polite that goes deeper than words, a silence that makes room for others. Aiko lived her whole life in the same small house on a street that smelled of grilled mackerel in the evenings and incense in the mornings. She kept her shoes in perfect rows, kept her sorrow even more neatly tucked. She had once loved painting, but the brushes dried out. She had once loved a man, but he married someone louder. Aiko didn't mind. Not at first. She worked as a clerk in a tiny post office, handled stamps with the same reverence others reserved for silk. She liked routine, liked stacking things, liked returning order to a world that so often felt like it had sneezed and forgotten her. She was not bitter, just folded. Folded so many times, you'd have thought she was meant to be an envelope. And so, when the end came, not sudden, not slow, just right on schedule, she felt mostly relief. She had followed the rules. She had caused no trouble. Surely that was enough. But what she awoke to was not a gate, not a hall, not a throne. It was a garden. Or perhaps more accurately, a memory disguised as a garden. It was dusk. The light was gold-tinted lavender, like a bruise beginning to forgive itself. The path beneath her feet was made of pale stones that clicked softly, like polite applause after a piano recital. And around her, blooms everywhere, but not normal flowers. No two were the same. Each one shimmered with a strange familiarity. The first one she touched smelled like matcha and her grandmother's shawl. She touched another and felt a jolt, like a bicycle wheel turning for the first time. This was her first sip of coffee. This one, her first snowfall. That one there, glowing violet, her first heartbreak, oddly beautiful in hindsight. She wandered. There was the tiny orange flower that held the moment she saw her own shadow move. When she was 5, and suddenly realized she was separate from the world, and I, not a we. There was a blossom that pulsed with warmth, the first time she held someone's hand and noticed they didn't pull away. The whole garden, it turned out, was built from firsts, every moment of discovery, every crack in the egg of her consciousness, every time the world said, "Look, this too is part of you." And it was beautiful, and it was heartbreaking, because she hadn't remembered most of them. She'd let them dissolve into the gray of habit. She'd filed them under not important. She'd told herself life had become dull, when really she had simply stopped noticing. She sat down beside a tree that bloomed with tiny bells, each one holding the chime of a laugh she hadn't expected to hear. And that's when the voice came. Not a person, not a god, just a voice, like someone speaking from inside her favorite teacup. "You believed your life was small," it said, "because you stopped looking close. You thought beauty had left," it whispered, "when really you stopped inviting it in." Aiko wept, not because she was sad, but because she was grateful to be proven wrong. She wandered deeper into the garden. Here was a flower shaped like a question mark, her first doubt. There, a spiky one, the first time she told someone no and meant it. In the distance, she saw herself at age 12, chasing a paper lantern across a field, and herself at 73, sighing in her kitchen, just before discovering that miso and honey are beautiful together, even if no one else ever tastes. She began to laugh again, the kind of laugh you hear through tears when someone reminds you that you were never foolish, just learning. She realized this garden wasn't static. It grew as she remembered. Each new awareness bloomed a new petal. Each smile called forth a fruit from a tree. She stayed for a long while. You would too. It smelled like toasted sesame in childhood. Eventually a new path appeared, leading somewhere beyond the edge of remembering. She looked back only once, at the garden, at the life she thought had been empty, and she bowed, not out of duty, but out of awe, because it had all been there, waiting for her eyes to soften. The archivist of moments. His name was Bernard, but everyone called him Benny, except the woman at the dry cleaners, who insisted on calling him Mr. B, as if he were a jazz legend. He died at 64 with ink stains on his fingers and half a sentence left in his notebook. He was always leaving sentences half finished. It was a habit he disguised as style. Benny had once dreamed of being a novelist, not just a writer, a novelist, the kind of person who walks briskly, wears scarves indoors, and knows how to use the word longing without sounding ridiculous. He wrote one book, self-published, 12 copies sold, 11 to family, 1 to a stranger who thought it was a cookbook and returned it. He worked for 30 years as a receptionist in a dentist's office with slow afternoons and fast coffee. He wasn't unhappy, but he wasn't fulfilled, which is a very specific ache, like missing a song you've never heard, but swear exists somewhere. He had a cat named Sagan. He liked clouds that looked like animals, and he always gave money to street musicians, even if they played badly. He said anyone brave enough to be heard deserved to be thanked, and when Benny died, in his sleep, as kindly as he had lived, he expected nothing. He assumed death would be a polite off-switch. Instead, he woke up in a library, not one with fluorescent lights and the smell of plastic. No, this was a cathedral of memory. The ceilings were impossibly high. The shelves curved like waves frozen in wood. There were ladders that moved on their own, dust that shimmered like old piano notes, and a sense, almost like cinnamon, of importance. At the center, a desk, and behind it, a figure, neither man nor woman, more like a well-dressed whisper. They wore spectacles that flickered with every memory Benny had ever doubted. "Ah," the figure said, with the warmth of someone greeting a regular. "Welcome to the archive," Benny blinked. "Of what?" The figure smiled. "Of you." And with a gesture, the room opened. Each shelf held vials, tiny glowing containers with swirling light inside, like snow globes made of feeling. Benny picked one up. Inside was a memory, a brief moment at a bus stop, where he had helped a woman with her broken shopping bag. She had smiled. He had smiled back. It had lasted 7 seconds, and yet, here it was, filed, preserved, glowing. He picked up another, a conversation he had forgotten entirely. He had once told a teenage niece that it was okay not to know what she wanted to be, that adults were just older children trying to figure things out. She had never told him, but that sentence had carried her through a decade of self-doubt. There were thousands of these, moments he hadn't considered worth remembering, moments that had changed people. Some were simple: a held door, a compliment, a laugh that softened someone's day. Some were more subtle, the way he always said thank you to the man who emptied the bins in his building. The man had once considered quitting, but Benny's daily gratitude made him feel visible. And tucked in a corner he found one special vial. It held a glowing version of his failed novel. Not the book itself, but a passage. A strange poetic paragraph about a man who eats cold soup in winter and wonders if anyone truly knows him. That passage had stayed with the stranger who accidentally bought the book. He had read it while recovering from surgery. It had made him cry. Not because it was sad, but because it was honest. He never returned the book after all. He kept it on his nightstand. Benny sat down. His legs felt wobbly the way they do when you discover you were seen more than you knew. And then the archivist spoke again. You thought your story was unwritten, but it was just shelved in other people. You believed failure was quiet, but even silence leaves echoes. You thought you were small, but your kindness filed entire sections. Benny cried, but not like a man grieving, like a man listening to himself for the very first time. He spent what felt like years there, revisiting, rereading, marveling at the story his life had told through other people's days. And when he was ready, the archivist handed him a notebook. This time, they said gently, you can finish the sentences. He opened it. The pages were blank, but the ink had already started humming. The Great Rehearsal. His name was Emmanuel, but everyone called him Manu, except his grandmother, who refused to shorten anything. She believed names, like prayers, should be spoken in full. Manu died at 29, too young if you asked anyone. A car accident? Sudden. The kind that turns time into glass and never gives you the courtesy of goodbye. He had been an actor, not a famous one, not the kind with trailers and contracts. He was the kind who performed under buzzing lights in a community theater where the chairs squeaked and the air always smelled faintly of old carpet and hairspray. He loved it, all of it. The rustle of curtains, the warmth of stage lights on his skin, the nervous thrill before a line, the invisible thread between him and the audience when silence stretched just right. But he never got his big break. No blockbuster. No standing ovation from 1,000 people. Just a small life, lit from below by footlights and filled with dreams, stitched together with duct tape. He had recently started writing his own play. It was messy. It was brave. It was unfinished. When he died, he thought, that's it. The curtain closed. The role ended. The audience gone. But when he opened his eyes again, he was backstage, not metaphorically. There were literal curtains stretching to infinity, dressing rooms made of clouds, script pages fluttering like birds overhead, a velvet hush in the air, like breath held before a performance. And there, people, hundreds of them, all in costumes, some in pajamas, some in royal robes, some wearing nothing but paint. They were rehearsing, not for this life, for the next. Each person here was preparing for who they'd become next time around. A girl practicing how to walk with courage, a boy learning how to say, I'm sorry, without flinching. There were mothers learning to let go, fathers learning to cry, poets learning how to plant tomatoes, each one with their own little monologue, their own quiet scene. And in this place, Manu was not the star. He was the coach. He helped others rehearse their hardest lines. He held trembling hands as someone tried to say, "I forgive you." He sat cross-legged in the wings, listening as a man rehearsed how to ask for help for the very first time. He adjusted timing, suggested pauses, wiped tears, gave nods of approval. He didn't ask why he was here. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew. He had spent his entire life learning how to be vulnerable in front of others. Now he would help others do the same. It wasn't grand, it wasn't glamorous, but it was holy. Every day, if days existed there, new souls came through the curtains, shaky and unsure, and he greeted them all with a smile that said, "You're going to be wonderful. Let's try again." Sometimes he got to step in, to play the scene partner, to be the one they broke up with, or the one they begged to stay. It didn't matter. Every role he played with truth, and he found something he had never expected. Satisfaction, because even though the audience was gone, the meaning remained. There were no reviews, no critics, just a quiet knowing that he was helping someone become braver than they thought they could be. Eventually, he passed by a mirror, and for the first time, he didn't see himself. He saw all the people who had found their voice because he had helped them find it. They were laughing, crying, screaming into pillows, whispering apologies to the wind. He smiled. There was no final bow, just a warm spotlight that followed him as he walked quietly into the next scene. The extraordinary, ordinary. His name was Javier, and if you asked him about his life, he'd shrug and say something like, nothing special. He was born in a town where the most exciting thing was a yearly parade of oversized paper heads and a bakery that changed the window display with the seasons. He worked in an office where nothing caught fire, no one embezzled anything, and no one had affairs, unless you count that one awkward moment in '98. But no one talks about that. Javier took the same bus to work for 37 years. He ate the same breakfast, toast, a banana, and half a cup of coffee that somehow always cooled too quickly. He never traveled far. He liked his own bed and his shoes, which he resold 3 times instead of buying new ones. He never climbed a mountain, never skydived, never found himself in Bali. Instead, he found himself in grocery store queues, in quiet dinners with his sister, and watching pigeons navigate air currents between buildings. He often wondered if he had wasted it, life, if he had somehow sat in the waiting room and missed the show. When he died, in his sleep, peacefully, he felt a small twinge of regret, not pain, not fear, just that soft ache you get when you realize the book is closing and you barely remember the middle chapters. But when he opened his eyes again, he was standing in a room. No, a museum. Not of art, not of war, not of dinosaurs or historical figures. It was a museum of days, and it was his. Endless corridors, walls stretching like timelines, each room containing one day of his life, archived, preserved, illuminated. In the first room, a Tuesday in March, 1987, he had spilled orange juice and missed the bus. He'd thought the whole day ruined. But here, he saw the sunlight coming through the curtain that morning, the warmth on his hands as he cleaned the floor, the stranger who gave him a ride and told him a joke that made him laugh for 2 stops too long. He wandered through his days, one by one, each room different, each alive. There was a room for the day. He cried in the shower because he didn't know what he wanted from life. The water in that room was music, and the echo of his breath had become a song of courage. There was a room for every walk he ever took alone, now filled with whispers from the trees and echoes of his own thoughts he never realized were so gentle. He stopped at one room, a Monday, rainy. He had made lentils, watched a documentary about whales, fell asleep on the couch. He had written in his journal that night, "I wasted today," but here the room pulsed with soft light. The sound of rain on the window was its own orchestra. The smell of lentils, rich, earthy, comforting, wrapped around him like a warm blanket. The walls displayed the smallest details: how the couch had cradled his back, how his breath had deepened as he slept, how the whales had sung and he, though unaware, had smiled. He looked around and whispered, "I didn't waste it, did I?" And the room responded, not in words, but in warmth. Eventually he came to a chamber, marked only with a question. "What did you build?" He stepped inside and found a city, not made of stone, not metal, but of moments. Every meal he cooked for someone else had become a lantern hanging in the sky. Every time he held his tongue, offered kindness, waited patiently, had become a street, smooth and safe for others to walk. The entire city pulsed with the rhythms of his rituals: brushing his teeth, feeding the cat, watering the plants. Every repeated action had laid a brick, and together they made a home for something larger than him. He stood in the middle of the city, tears in his eyes. He had thought he'd been ordinary, but the city said otherwise. He had not climbed Everest. He had climbed his own mornings for 40 years without fanfare. He had not fought dragons. He had fought discouragement, loneliness, boredom, and had won by showing up anyway. The museum did not end. It opened into sky, and he walked forward, finally understanding. The adventure had never been somewhere else. It had been beneath his feet the whole time. The room of their hands. Her name was Miriam. She died at 61 on a cool morning when the kettle had just begun to boil and a sparrow landed just once on her windowsill. She was alone when she passed, but not lonely. She had spent a lifetime learning the difference. Miriam had been a quiet child, the kind who draws faces in condensation on car windows and doesn't speak unless she has something that really needs saying. Her childhood was complicated. Not a tragedy, no, just full of sharp edges. Her parents were good people, but tightly wound. Her father believed silence was strength. Her mother loved through doing, cooking, cleaning, fixing hems, but rarely said the actual words. No one hit her. No one left. But sometimes not being held can feel like a kind of absence that echoes longer than yelling. Miriam grew up carrying a quiet ache. She longed to be seen, but rarely felt visible. She learned to be strong, or at least to pretend convincingly. She became a teacher. She married, then divorced. She raised 2 sons with a tenderness she had to invent from scratch. She never blamed her parents, but deep inside, there was a small locked box marked, "Why couldn't you love me better?" And when she died, she half expected to find out the answer. Instead, she woke in a house Not heaven, just a house, familiar in the way dreams are, part memory, part magic. There was a hallway with uneven tiles, a radio playing distant violin, the smell of something baking, and a feeling in the air like someone had just stepped out of the room. Miriam followed the scent through soft doorways into a sun-drenched kitchen, and there at the table, her parents, younger than she remembered, a little confused, a little uncertain, but real. They looked up, and for the first time in a long, long time, they looked at her like they saw her. Her father opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Then finally, I didn't know how, Miriam sat down. Her hands trembled. So did his. Her mother placed a teacup in front of her. It rattled slightly on the saucer. I thought I was protecting you, she said, by not crying, by being strong. But I see now. What you needed was my softness. And then Miriam spoke. A lifetime of words loosened all at once. She told them about the nights she cried into her pillow, the times she won awards and wished they'd come, the way she had learned to hold her own children with a kind of desperation. They listened, truly listened, not defensively, not with explanations, but with the softness of people finally brave enough to be human. Then something strange happened. The kitchen faded, and the house opened into a room Miriam had never seen before. It was filled with hands, millions of them, suspended in soft light. Some were large and rough, some small and trembling, all frozen in gestures, hugging, brushing hair, offering a spoon, covering a wound, reaching out, but not always touching. She stepped inside and suddenly she could feel them all. Hands of mothers trying to soothe when they themselves were in pain. Hands of fathers who wanted to say, I love you, but didn't know what shape that phrase made in the air. And there, her parents' hands, as young adults, as children, as the same uncertain, aching creatures she had been. She wept, because suddenly she understood. They were not towers, they were not gods, they were not failures. They were people, people with parents of their own, with fears they never named, with wounds they never healed. And they had loved her the only way they knew how, which sometimes wasn't quite enough, but still was real. In that room, Miriam forgave them, and forgave herself too, for holding the hurt so tightly for so long. She stepped out into a garden where her own children were waiting. She hugged them. They didn't ask where she'd been, but somehow they knew she was lighter, because in the afterlife, we don't erase what was. We understand it, and sometimes that's all the healing we ever needed. The whisper that wasn't yours. His name was Theo, and he lived a good life. Not a lucky life, no, not charmed. He had his share of flat tires, broken hearts, bad knees, and difficult relatives, but still it was a life of meaning, of mornings with coffee, of kisses before sleep, of work that tired the body, but never quite wore out the soul. He had loved, he had built, he had watched his daughter learn to tie her shoes, and his partner forget where they left the keys for the 17th year in a row. He had laughed more than most, helped more than he remembered, and was remembered more than he ever realized, and yet there had always been that noise, not loud, not unbearable, just always there. A low, persistent hum of concern, of tension just beneath the skin. The the background whisper of what if. What if he was forgetting something? What if the deal fell through? What if the roof leaked? What if someone he loved was hurting and hadn't said? No one would have called him anxious. But if you pressed a hand to his chest, you might feel a small knot. Not pain exactly, more like a question that never got answered. He managed it well. He smiled. He planned. He adjusted. He was a quiet kind of brave. He didn't fight the world. He just moved through it with a gentle caution, like a man crossing a floor he's not sure is fully dry. And when he died, peacefully, a soft exhale in his garden chair, he thought, maybe now I'll finally get some rest. And oh, he did, but not the way he expected. He awoke in a playground, not made of plastic or wood, but of clouds and color, and warm light that smelled like vanilla and fresh notebooks. The swing sets didn't creak. They hummed lullabies. The slides glowed with slow, golden gradients, and the sandbox sparkled as if it had once been stars. And sitting on a merry-go-round, spinning slowly, was someone. Not quite a god, not quite a child, something in between. They wore robes that looked like a patchwork of childhood drawings. Dinosaurs, rainbows, wonky suns with too many rays. Their hair was wild, their eyes ancient, their smile utterly mischievous. Ah, they said, dragging the sound like a cat stretches. You made it. Theo blinked. Is this heaven? The being chuckled. No thrones here. Just the Department of Misunderstood Effort. Theo sat on a swing cautiously. It held him, of course. Clouds know how to cradle. He looked around. It was beautiful, peaceful, but he still felt the hum. And then the being turned to him, tilted their head, and said gently, that voice, that hum, it was never yours. Theo stared. You spent a lifetime reacting to a whisper that didn't belong to you, they said. A whisper inherited from a long line of good people who believed worry was love. Theo felt tears press at his eyes. But you were quietly stoic, not in the stiff upper lip way, in the true way. You adapted, you focused, you helped where you could and let go when you couldn't. You didn't name it, but you lived it. Theo swallowed. The being stood, walked toward him with bare feet that left laughter in their steps. You thought peace meant zero noise, they whispered, but it was never about the noise. It was about which voice you answered. Theo looked down at his hands, the same ones that had held newborns, scooped leaves, gripped steering wheels in stormy weather. They were still here, but lighter now, as if he had finally set down something he didn't realize he'd been carrying. He looked up. The sky above was shifting, now showing scenes from his life. Not the big ones, not weddings or awards, but the day he fixed the washing machine without swearing, the night he chose to sleep instead of argue, the moment he let someone else be right and genuinely didn't mind. These weren't victories, they were acts of serenity, and the God-child mystery beside him beamed. You kept the world from falling apart in 100 small ways, they said. That's what quiet heroism looks like. Not fireworks, just not making things worse. Theo laughed. A real one? A belly-deep, startled laugh that tasted like mint and honey and the absence of worry. The being clapped. Now that, they said, is the sound of someone finally realizing they did enough. Theo stayed for a while. Played catch with a breeze, wrote in chalk that disappeared with every giggle, swung higher than gravity would allow. Eventually, he walked toward the exit, where nothing waited for him, except everything. But before he passed through, he heard the being call out, "Next time you hear that whisper, ask it who it belongs to before you give it your peace." And then the playground faded, and Theo, at long last, was still. The field where we felt her name was Alma, and for most of her life, she believed she was alone. Not in the dramatic way. She had family, co-workers, even pets, but somewhere deeper, beneath her skin and behind her ribs, she carried a quiet echo that never seemed to bounce back. She could walk through crowds and feel like wallpaper. She could cry in the shower and dry off before anyone noticed. Her feelings felt like whispers in a storm, faint, brief, forgotten. She was kind, but not remarkable, loving, but not needed. She lived but never quite felt woven into anything. And when she died, in the quiet of an overcast morning, with a kettle just beginning to sing, she felt unfinished. She thought maybe I was just static, a space between the signals. And then she opened her eyes, not to clouds, not to gates, to grass, endless, gentle swaying grass, a field wide as memory, soft as breath. It stretched beyond the horizon, under a sky, the color of a size. She stood barefoot and felt it, not the grass but presence, all around her, under her, through her. Emotions, not just hers. She stepped forward. A patch of flowers pulsed softly to her right. The scent, cinnamon and rain. The feeling, longing. Another cluster to her left, lavender and chalk. Regret. Each plant was tied to a feeling, and each feeling to someone. She knelt by a golden bloom, glowing like laughter in a dark room. She touched it, and suddenly saw a stranger on a train in 1982, gripping their coat after losing someone they couldn't mourn aloud. She gasped. The feeling wasn't hers, but it had passed through her once, a memory. She had cried that same night, without knowing why. The field pulsed again. She understood. This wasn't heaven. It wasn't even a place. It was a network of every emotion ever felt, planted, rooted, shared. Joy bloomed beside grief. Shame curled beneath compassion. Each stem intertwined, growing through centuries and strangers and quiet, aching souls like hers. Alma wandered. She found a corner of the field where people had felt hope without reason. She remembered one winter night. She had smiled at the stars without knowing why, and now saw thousands had done the same, at different times in different languages, but with the same upward breath. She began to cry, not from sadness, but from connection, because now she knew every emotion she'd ever held was never hers alone. Even her loneliness had company, and in this place, company didn't mean noise. It meant belonging. It meant that every echo she sent had always returned, just in a language she couldn't hear until now. She lay down in the grass. It embraced her, not with arms, but with the hush of understanding. The blades beneath her shifted, like pages of a shared diary, and above her the sky shimmered with every heart that had ever broken, healed, and beat again. Alma closed her eyes, not to sleep, not to disappear, but because for the first time she felt held by the quiet truth. We are never truly alone in what we feel. She was part of the field now, and the field would always remember her. the box beneath the floorboards. It began with dust, thick, slow, quiet, the kind of dust that doesn't fall but settles, like memory, like grief, and beneath it, wood, and beneath that, a box, simple, wooden, worn at the edges, its hinges slightly rusted, its lock long since broken. No one had touched it in 62 years, not since the day a girl, no older than 16, slid it beneath the floorboards of her childhood bedroom, just before leaving and never coming back. She had placed it there with hands that trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of goodbye. Inside the box, a bundle of things that didn't seem important to the world, but were everything to her. A letter, never sent, a dried flower, a photo with one corner missing, a ring tied with thread, and a drawing, childish messy, of two people holding hands beneath a tree. The box had waited, waited in darkness, waited as footsteps came and went, waited through renovations, through silence, through decades of being forgotten by the very person who once whispered, "I'll come back for you." But she never did. The girl, now a woman, then an old woman, had lived an entire life above that floor, never knowing her box still breathed beneath it, until one morning she died, alone, in a home that had grown old with her. And something strange happened. The moment her breath faded, the box stirred. Not physically, not in the way objects move, but something in it awoke. A light, soft and golden, filtered through the cracks in the wood. And suddenly the box wasn't beneath the floorboards anymore. It was somewhere else. A vast space, dimly lit, lined with shelves that reached no ceiling, and floors made of soft cloth, as if someone had unspooled 1,000 childhood blankets. All around, other boxes, other suitcases, other hidden things, now glowing gently in the dark. And from within this box, the contents began to stir. The photo lifted first, not with fingers but with memory. It hovered, then shimmered, and became a moment. A girl in a yellow dress, laughing beside a lake. Someone, off-frame, holding the camera. The warmth of the sun that day was still in the edges of the paper. Next the letter. Still sealed, still unsent, but now it unfolded itself, and the ink, though faded, began to hum. It had been written on a night of tears, with hope sharp enough to cut. "Dear M," it read, "I don't know if you ever think of me, but I think of you, sometimes with joy, sometimes with fire, always with something that refuses to be quiet." The letter glowed, and then a figure appeared, not the girl, but the feeling of her, or maybe her younger self, or maybe something in between. She looked around, confused, then saw the box, and gasped, not out of fear, but because she remembered. "This," she whispered, "this is where I kept the parts of me I thought no one would ever understand." She touched the dried flower. It crumbled, but in the crumbling came a scent, spring rain and piano lessons, and that day she almost kissed someone, but ran away instead. Each object opened a door. Each memory spoke, not in sentences, but in feeling. She remembered how much she had felt and how little she had ever said. The ring, a gift from a friend who once told her, "You are more than you pretend to be." She had never believed them, until now. The drawing, oh, the drawing. 2 stick figures, a tree, one labeled me, the other just a question mark. "I always hoped I'd find that person," she said, "but I never did." She sat. The floor was warm. The light around her pulsed with gentle breath, and the box, now empty, was not empty at all. It held her, and the proof that even the things we hide away carry us forward, quietly, until we are ready to see them again. The space around her shifted, not with sound but with intention. The shelves now felt closer, as if they'd been listening, as if her memories had called out to others, and they had. One by one, other boxes began to hum, not loudly, just enough to be noticed by the kind of silence that listens. Some were covered in lace, others wrapped in children's drawings, or pressed flowers, or faded receipts. Each one belonged to someone who, at some point, had hidden a part of themselves because they thought no one would care. And now, they all glowed, not like fire, like breath, like someone finally exhaling after holding it in for years. The box, was no longer beneath anything. It hovered gently, surrounded by memory, but no longer burdened by it. And then she saw something she hadn't expected. Another person, not a stranger, not someone she knew, but someone familiar in the way books can feel familiar, even unread. He walked toward her slowly, holding something in his hand, a letter, errand still folded, still never delivered. "I found this," he said, "in a second-hand book. I didn't know who wrote it, but I kept it." She gasped. Tears welled. "You kept it?" He nodded. "It made me feel less alone. So I read it once a year, like a ritual. I always wondered if the person who wrote it ever knew how much it mattered." She couldn't speak, not because she had no words, but because the moment itself was the answer. He smiled. "Thank you," he said, and vanished, like a candle being blown out by gratitude. She sat back down, but this time, not in sorrow, in awe, because what she had hidden had never stopped moving. Even forgotten, it had kept breathing. Even buried, it had grown roots in someone else's story. She looked back into the box. It was no longer hers alone. It now shimmered with threads that led to people she'd never met. A teenager in another country who kept a pressed flower in her journal because it reminded her of something unnamed. An old man who wore a ring around his neck for reasons he couldn't explain. A child who drew 2 stick figures under a tree without knowing why. She understood. Some things never arrive where we meant to send them, but they still arrive, and that was enough. The box began to close itself, not to hide, but to rest. The light inside pulsed once more, and then softly, it lowered itself back into the floor of a room in a world that kept turning. Someone would find it again, someday. Someone would need it and open it, not for her, but for themselves. And in that moment, her story would begin again, because love, even unspoken, even hidden, never stays buried forever.